Hi everyone, welcome to another workshop hosted by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis and I'm one of the faculty here at the Writing Support Center. And today we're going to be talking about a very common topic, probably one of the most common questions that we get at the WSC, and that is flow. As a reminder, all of our workshops come with an accompanying worksheet if you are receiving extra credit or if you are being asked to complete this worksheet or watch this workshop as a part of an assignment, please be sure to fill out that worksheet. Uh, on the screen, you will see an agenda of today's discussion. So we're going to be talking about what is flow, coherence, otherwise known as global flow, analyzing coherence, and finally cohesion, also known as local flow. What is flow? Flow refers to writing that reads smoothly from beginning to end. So oftentimes in the WSC, we get students coming in asking, does my essay flow? And so when you're asking that question, you're asking, does my essay read smoothly from beginning to end? Is there a logic in the way that the essay is moving? And is it structured so that it's clear and easy to follow? Flow consists of coherence and cohesion, and we're going to be talking about what that means in terms of the essay. Coherence is also known as global flow, which refers to how your ideas are organized at the higher levels. So this includes the paragraphs, sections, chapters, etc. It's how you're organizing your essay as a whole rather than looking at the individual sentences. There's no one way to organize essays. Some really common organization patterns include chronological, so either presenting a history or a step-by-step process, starting from like the beginning and then going all the way to the present. You can group similar ideas together, such as advantages and disadvantages, cause and effect. This might be the model that you use in a compare and contrast essay. Moving from large to small or vice versa, so starting really broad in your essay and then slowly getting more and more specific, or starting really specific and explaining how it affects the broader argument. You can also use assertion, evidence, and reasoning, so presenting your argument, your evidence, and then the reasoning why it's important. And this might be an organization method that you use in an argumentative essay. You can also do introduction, method, results, and discussion, and you might use this format for lab reports. This is not a all-inclusive list. These are just some of the most common ways that you can organize an essay, but of course there are definitely more ways that you can organize it that you might be learning in class or might be more specific to the type of essay that you're writing. One thing to also keep in mind is that you can use multiple organizational strategies in an essay. So you can have one pattern for the draft as a whole. So for example, you may be talking about a topic that requires you to go in a chronological order. However, the individual paragraphs or sections of the essay, you might want to be grouping similar ideas together. So you can have multiple organizational patterns in your essay. It all just depends on what you feel is going to work best to show a relationship between your ideas. And really that's what global flow is looking at how your ideas relate to one another, and whether that relationship makes sense and makes it easy for the reader to follow without having to go back and reread it and try to make the connection for themselves. If your reader is able to follow your organization and see how you're connecting your ideas, then your paper flows. So that's part of the reason why flow is really important, and part of the reason why students are always looking to see, if their paper flows. It's because it is important for the reader to understand the logic between the ideas. because it shows a mastery, and it also shows an understanding and an ability to show the relationship between these ideas. So on the accompanying worksheet, read the sample assignment prompt and decide the primary and additional pattern of the essay that you would use to organize this paper. You can include, please include examples of the topics these additional patterns would focus on. So on the accompanying worksheet, there's a sample assignment prompt. As we mentioned before, you can use multiple organizational structures in an essay. So you can have a primary structure, which is the essay as a whole, and you can also have a secondary pattern, and this secondary pattern is referring to the individual paragraphs. So take a moment to look at those sample assignments and decide how would you organize this paper. And then for the additional pattern of the essay, just be sure to include examples of the topics that you would potentially focus on. And you can always rewind the video just to take a look at some of the common organization patterns that we use when writing essays. So as I mentioned, one of the most common questions that we get in the WSC is, does my paper flow? And you can definitely ask someone, you can ask a tutor, you can ask a friend, ask your professor to give you that feedback. But what if you haven't had the opportunity to go see someone for feedback? What if you wanted to check for yourself if your essay is flowing? So there are a couple ways where you can check for yourself whether or not your paper is making logical sense. And one of those ways is reverse outlining. So you can try creating an outline based on the topics you wrote. So once you have your essay written, if you want to check for flow, if you want to make sure that it's going smoothly from beginning to end, take a look at that essay and pull out your main ideas and topics that you have written, and try to create an outline based on those topics in the order that you are presenting them in the paper. And once you have that done, once you've created your reverse outline, take a look over at your topics and consider the following questions. How are you ordering ideas? Can you describe the pattern? So again, going back to those common organizational patterns, can you name the type of pattern that you're using in the essay? Why are the ideas presented in this order? Would they make more sense if you reorder them? So once you pinpoint the type of pattern that you used, think about whether this pattern best represents the response to the prompt, or if maybe a different pattern would work better to show your ideas. What effect does the order of ideas have on your reader? Does this presentation of ideas help your reader go through it smoothly? Are you trying to get them to see a relationship between ideas? Are you trying for them to have a timeline? What are you hoping that your reader gets from this pattern? How would reordering the information affect your paper? So if you were to change up the pattern, would that end up changing the meaning of your essay? Would that end up changing the presentation? And would that create a stronger paper, or would that end up not being the most helpful course of action? So just taking that moment to see what is happening, and organizing your ideas and trying to see whether this pattern that you chose is making the most sense for your essay. Another strategy that you can use to see if your essay is flowing on as a whole is by using color coding. So color coding can help you group similar ideas or ideas that are connected in various ways. So what you want to do for color coding is you want to assign ideas, themes, or topics a color, and then you go through the paper highlighting these ideas in the color assigned. So for example, if you are writing a paper on how student services contribute to student success, then you might want to assign a color to the Writing Support Center, and then you would assign another color to the Math Success Center, and then another color to the Learning Assistance Center. And then from there, you'd decide, what are some of the points that you're making in your essay and assign a color to those individual points. And so once you've gone through your essay, assigning those different colors, and you've marked those areas in their colors, you're able to see how you talk about these topics and how frequently you talk about the topics. And then from there, you want to try to figure out how these ideas relate to one another, both in their color groups and between their color groups. So some questions to consider would be, how do the blue ideas relate to one another? How does this blue idea connect to the yellow idea? Not to say that you're going to use blue and yellow, but it's just for you to see that you can try to see the relationship between the colors that you've assigned to these topics and ideas, and try to see whether they're relating to one another, and whether the relationship that the pattern that you've chosen is providing a logical demonstration of ideas. So that takes us into our second activity. So refer to an essay draft you are currently working on or have worked on in the past. Choose either reverse outlining or color coding to check for cohesion. So again, we're looking at the global flow of the essay as a whole. After you have tested for cohesion, answer the following questions. How are you ordering ideas? Is there a pattern? Why are the ideas presented in this order? Do you need to reorder them? How are the ideas relating to one another? So take a moment to refer to either a draft you currently have or a draft that you have worked on in the past, and choose one of these two methods to see how the ideas are relating to one another, and then in the space provided on the worksheet, answer the questions. So global flow or coherence is only one of the types of flows that occur in an essay. We also have cohesion, which is local flow, which refers to ideas connecting clearly on a sentence level. With clearer connections between sentences, readers can move smoothly from one sentence to the other without having to go back and forth and try to reread something in order to understand it. So you're really trying to make sure that your sentences move smoothly to one another. So we started from the broad spectrum of global flow, and now we're getting to the smaller pieces, which is the individual sentences. And there's a number of ways that you can organize on a sentence level, and we're going to go through those different ways that you can organize. The first one is known to new sequencing. So information is organized from the familiar, otherwise known as the known information, to suddenly the unfamiliar or the new information. This allows readers to focus on the new information because they don't have to process too much new information at once. Readers often are able to process information that they already know much quicker than brand new information. So when you present that information in a combination, starting off with something that your reader may already know, and then introducing them to this brand new information, your reader is able to get through your essay much more quickly and smoothly because they don't have to process a lot of new information. They're able to say like, oh yes, I know this. Oh, I didn't know this. And then they're able to focus on that second part a little more. Another way that you can organize your sentences clearly is through transitional expressions. So transitions indicate a logical relationship between ideas. This could be showing similarities, contrasts, additions, cause and effect, examples, etc. We actually have a transitions handout that you can reference if transitions has always been something that you wanted to work on, or that you've been told that you need to include a little more. You can find that transitions handout in the module alongside this workshop and the accompanying worksheet. So feel free to reference that. And there's more different types of local flows. And we're going to go through each of one of these in just a moment. The first being parallel structure. So parallel structure is when you're using a grammatical structure for things with things that come in sets, and you're really trying to show a similarity by creating a rhythm that helps with the flow. So this could include when you're listing something, you can show the parallels by having the same type of structure in that list. So for example, he was walking, talking, and chewing gum. We're using the same verb tense for each of those individual verbs, and that helps with the flow. It creates a pattern, and your reader is just able to follow smoothly into the next sentence. Another local flow that you can use is this, these, and a summary noun. So oftentimes a common mistake that is seen in essays is that a writer will say this indicates, but they don't necessarily include what this is. So you want to make sure that you're including a summary noun, just so that way your reader has an understanding of what you're referring to when you say this, and then you have your action verb. So an example could include, you've just finished talking about the importance of the Supreme Court deciding to legalize gay marriage, and you want to talk about what that decision indicates. So instead of saying this indicates, you would say this decision indicates, and then go forward with your statement. You are reducing vagueness by adding the summary noun, and you're just making it clear to the reader what you're referring to. So you want to make sure that you have the summary noun whenever you want to say this or these. Another type of local flow is the clear pronoun reference. So whenever you're planning on using a pronoun, just making sure that you are making it very clear what that pronoun, what noun that pronoun is referring to. So if you're talking about a lot of different nouns, you might want to remind your reader of a specific noun before tying a pronoun to it. And then finally, getting to the verb. So nominalization, which is the act of changing a verb to a noun. This could be deciding. Decide is an action, but when we talk about it in the noun form, it's decision. But you want to make sure that the connection between a verb and a subject is clear, because sometimes when we use nominalization, we end up adding a lot of words in between the subject and the verb, and then it just makes it confusing. We get these really long multi-line sentences that can be a little hard to follow. So sometimes it's just being mindful when you're adding too many words in a sentence and it becomes wordy and awkward and just reads awkwardly. And that brings us to the end. So just a reminder, flow refers to how the ideas of an essay connect, both on the broad essay level and the sentence level. An essay can have multiple patterns of global flow. So one pattern for the essay as a whole, and then the other for the individual paragraphs. You can check for global flow by reverse outlining or color coding. And cohesion is flow that occurs on the sentence level. So this is our local flow. And there's several types as we've discussed. Flow is something that takes a while to get comfortable with. So it's okay if, you know, all of this information is overwhelming. A lot of times I recommend to students to focus on one type of flow at a time, just to get yourself comfortable with that flow, and then you can start incorporating more types. If you would like more information about flow, you can check out University of North Carolina Chapel Hill's Writing Center's article on flow. This workshop was adapted from that article, and they have a lot more examples, and they go into more detail in regards to some of the different types of local flows. Thank you so much. And as always, you're more than welcome to come visit the Writing Support Center anytime that you have a question or need support, or if you want someone to help you check if your flow is intact, our tutors are more than happy to help. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.